All right, folks, welcome back. I trust you all had a nourishing lunch. We are ready to begin our second panel, this one on religion and philanthropy. And Dave Specht is going to run us here. So Dave, I'll give it to you.
Thank you, Matt. Actually, I'm going to... Thank you, Matt. Well, it's after lunch. Are we going to stay awake for this, or are we going to sleep? These panelists will keep you awake, I promise. So I'm Dave Specht. I'm a senior fellow at the Drucker School Global Family Business Institute. My specific interests and professional mission is to preserve families and perpetuate businesses in that order. So it's kind of unique. I consult with multi-generational families around the world, and I'm curious about the intersection of religion and philanthropy with these families as well. And so I'm thrilled to be able to moderate this panel. I have three incredible panelists. I'll introduce them now, and then we'll give each of them 10 or so minutes to provide some opening comments. My first panelist is joining us via Zoom. Heather Curtis is a professor of religion and history at Tufts University, where she also serves as director of the Center of Humanities. Her first book on faith healing in the late 19th century United States received a Brewer Prize for best first book on Christian history from the American Society of Church History. Her most recent book, Holy Humanitarians, American Evangelicals and Global Aid, examines the crucial role of popular religious media played in the extension of U.S. aid at home and abroad from the late 19th century to early 20th century. So, Heather, thank you for joining us. Our next panelist is Kate Rosenblatt. Kate is the Cohen Assistant Professor of Religion and Jewish Studies at Emory University. She's a historian of American religion with a focus on the history and experience of American Jews. She's earned her bachelor's degree from Columbia University and the Jewish Theological Seminary, and both an MA in Jewish Studies and a PhD in American History from the University of Michigan. Her book, Cooperative Battlegrounds, Farmers, Workers, and the Search for Economic Alternatives, examines economic cooperatives in the 20th century United States. So, Kate, thanks for joining us. And my third panelist is Tanise Chung Hoon. Tanise holds a master's in education from the University of Utah and a PhD in educational leadership from Brigham Young University. After a career in educational administration at Utah Valley University and Brigham Young University in 2013, became managing director of Philanthropies, the advancement office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Philanthropies supports education, culture, and welfare work around the world. So, what an incredible panel. I'm looking forward to giving you the opportunity to learn about some of their interests and the ways that they're showing up in the world. And so we will first turn to Heather for some opening comments.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
You there? Okay, great. So I want to just start by thanking Matthew Bowman and David Specht for the opportunity to take part in this conversation and for accommodating my need to attend remotely. And I just also want to say that I'm going to read my comments so that I can keep myself to the 10-minute-ish time line. So if I look a little funny on the screen, it's because I'm reading. So let me get started and say that my perspective on this topic is shaped by my academic research on the history of religious philanthropy, but also by my experience over the last couple of years serving on the board of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, which is part of the Lilly School of Philanthropy in Indianapolis. And I'd be happy to share more about that organization and its work during the Q&A if that's of interest. My views are also informed by my own religious background and commitments. So as a child, I learned in my mainline Lutheran church about Jesus' teachings to sell your possessions to give to the poor, rather than accumulating wealth for yourself on earth. I remember participating in a crop walk to raise money for local food programs and international anti-hunger efforts, among other activities with my congregation. And these experiences led me to ask questions such as, why are so many people around the world and in our own neighborhoods suffering from poverty and hunger? Why do so many lack access to clean drinking water, to affordable housing and healthcare, to a good education? Why are so many of us indifferent to this suffering of our neighbors, and what should Christians do about it? These questions stuck with me over the years and eventually led me to pursue graduate study in religion and history, and to explore how Christians in the past endeavored to relieve suffering with the hope that the stories I uncovered would help put contemporary debates about poverty, hunger, welfare, immigration, philanthropy, and humanitarian intervention into a broader historical context, and hopefully provide some insight for contemporary efforts to alleviate affliction. So to get at these concerns, I focused my research on an organization called the Christian Herald, which published the world's most popular Christian newspaper from about 1890 to 1910, while also directly supporting numerous charitable organizations, including an orphanage in China, a fresh air summer home for children, an industrial school in the post-Reconstruction era South, and most prominently, the Bowery Mission, a soup kitchen in Manhattan that still exists today. My book, Holy Humanitarians, American Evangelicals and Global Aid, examines how the Christian Herald and its entrepreneurial leadership team, the minister Thomas DeWitt Talmage and publisher Louis Klopsch, engaged ordinary citizens from across the U.S. in efforts to assuage all kinds of adversity, from homelessness among New York City's unemployed, to poverty among formerly enslaved people in the South, from disease and destitution among survivors of massacres in Armenia, to hardships following natural disasters in India, China, Scandinavia, Macedonia, Japan, Italy, and Mexico. No other aid agency in this period, not even the American Red Cross, which was a direct competitor, came remotely close to matching the Christian Herald's fundraising record or ability to arouse popular concern for suffering within the United States and around the globe. So I'd like to share several key insights from this project that I think are relevant to the two questions we were asked to consider during this session. How do religious organizations and ideas define philanthropy in distinctive ways? How is philanthropy related to broader questions of religious identity and purpose? So first, in the late 19th century, religious leaders like Klopsch and Talmage insisted that philanthropy was democratic. Key to their extraordinary success as fundraisers was their claim that philanthropy was not the province of a privileged elite, but a popular devotional practice in which all citizens ought to participate. In a humanitarian crisis, each dollar made a difference, and every person who could spare a penny should share with sufferers in distress. Giving, Klopsch and Talmage argued, was a spiritual duty for all Christians, a way of imitating Jesus, obeying his commands to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, and a way of acknowledging that all possessions were gifts that ultimately belonged to God. Second, philanthropy was unifying. Engaging in a common enterprise of serving others, Klopsch and Talmage claimed, enabled individuals to overcome political disagreements, social prejudices, economic antagonism, regional animosities, cultural conflicts, and religious discord, all of which were on the rise during the late 19th and early 20th century. Whatever their differences in these arenas, surely, they argued, American citizens could unite around a shared commitment to the commandment, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Although the overwhelming majority of the Christian Herald's constituents were white Protestants, the editors took pains to include stories about African American churches and charitable institutions, to report on the plight of Native Americans and the poor treatment of Asian immigrants, to highlight the work of Jewish philanthropists, and to build bridges with Catholics. and at a time when many Protestant leaders supported racial segregation, expressed anti-Semitism, demonized immigrants, and accused the Pope of conspiring to take over the United States, the Christian Herald's ecumenism was noteworthy. Third, philanthropy required an expansive definition of who counts as a neighbor. The Christian Herald claimed that sufferers on the other side of the world were not strangers, but part of the same human family. The Bible proclaims that God, quote, hath made of one blood all the nations of the world. Therefore, the editors insisted charity, quote, must not be limited to our household, nor to our own countrymen, neither distance nor difference of race, nor unworthiness is to be a barrier. Like the Bible story of the Good Samaritan who stopped to help a foreigner, the Christian Herald subscribers should extend mercy beyond geographical borders and social boundaries. Given these convictions, Talmage and Klopsch were deeply troubled by the rising antipathy towards immigrants that was spreading among American citizens in the latter decades of the 19th century. Growing hostility towards newcomers, they worried, threatened the United States' status as, quote, a refuge for the oppressed and the downtrodden of every clime, where all are welcome and all may abide in peace and safety. From their earliest days at the helm of the Christian Herald, they committed themselves to counteracting escalating anti-immigrant sentiment by publishing articles condemning restrictive laws, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, and emphasizing the benefits of embracing diverse peoples who could contribute to the nation's destiny. To, quote, build up a wall against immigrants, Talmage preached, was to obstruct God's plan for making America, quote, the greatest nation of the ages. Instead, Christians should support charitable endeavors designed to help refugees fleeing violence, persecution, and economic hardship, and enable them to find jobs, adequate housing, proper health care, and educational opportunities for their children in the United States. Through their work at the Bowery Mission, Klopsch and Talmage saw firsthand the difficulties immigrants and other hungry, unemployed, and unhoused people faced in an increasingly volatile economic environment. And this leads to my fourth and final point. Philanthropy also required an expansive repertoire of approaches to relieving suffering. Even as they engaged readers in disaster relief campaigns and encouraged the funding of domestic charities, Klopsch and Talmage insisted that responding to emergencies and alleviating the symptoms of social crises through soup kitchens and summer camps was not enough. Christians were called to embrace a more capacious vision for reforming global society that would reflect the principles of Christ's kingdom, the promises of justice, righteousness, and peace. As they became aware of the structural inequalities that characterized American society, these philanthropists used their platform at the Christian Herald to advocate for a variety of legislative measures, such as fair labor laws, child protection statutes, fair housing policies, and an expansion of public works projects designed to mitigate the adverse effects of laissez-faire capitalism among the country's most vulnerable populations. In response to contemporary critics, especially proponents of so-called scientific philanthropy, like industrial magnate Andrew Carnegie, who blamed the needy for their plight and criticized charitable handouts, the Christian Herald insisted that, quote, what pauperizes the people is not the helping hand they occasionally get at a pinch from their sympathetic brothers and sisters, but low sweatshop wages, exorbitant rents, high prices for food. For how much of this the poor themselves are responsible, any fair-minded person can judge. Ultimately, what was required, Klopsch and Talmage argued, was, quote, some radical change to address the real root of the problem. We all see that there needs to be a redistribution of property, Talmage preached. To make this case, the Christian Herald actively promoted the platform of Christian socialism, put forward by the Reverend Charles Sheldon, a minister famous for coining the slogan, "What would Jesus do?" Contemporary Christians who wear WWJD paraphernalia might be surprised to learn that Sheldon advocated for a social revolution that would substitute cooperation for competition in commercial enterprises and institute, quote, common ownership of common needs, such as transportation facilities, heating and electric utilities, water and food sources, and healthcare, in order to create, quote, a new and different order of social life based on the teaching of the Golden Rule and the Sermon on the Mount. Christian socialism, Sheldon insisted, was a clear expression of economic theories plainly stated in the Bible, and therefore ought to be espoused by all those who desire to usher in the kingdom of God. So I hope this brief overview of some of my key findings in Holy Humanitarians gives us a starting point for our larger conversation about the connections between religion and philanthropy. So many of the issues I touched on and that the Christian Herald confronted remain central in our current political moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Kate, we'll have you go next.
Thanks so much for having me. Can you all hear? Sort of? Okay, yikes. Okay, now you can hear me? Wonderful. I'm thrilled to be here, and my remarks will very much, I think, sort of come to focus on the second question about broader questions of religious identity and purpose. But I thought I might just start briefly, I won't stay there very long, in the 17th century, at the very sort of place where most Jewish historians would begin American Jewish history, which is in 1654, when a group of what were then called the Hebrews of the Portuguese nation landed in New Amsterdam. They had sort of been descendants of the Jews who had been expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. They had found their way to Holland, a sort of place in that period that was known for being sort of religiously tolerant. They had then made their way to Dutch colonies in South America, but after Portugal retakes those colonies, those Jews who had found their way to Brazil are worried about the Inquisition coming back. So they intend to go back to Europe. They get waylaid by a Spanish privateer in the Caribbean, and they end up in New Amsterdam, where they encounter Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch colonial governor. And Peter Stuyvesant has a response that is very concerned about this arrival of these Jews, and he seeks to expel them. And so he writes a letter to the Dutch West India Company, essentially explaining, because of their deceitful practices, because they're usurers, because they blaspheme the name of Christ, that they should leave. And in the meantime, this group of Jews writes a letter to their fellow Jewish co-religionists in Amsterdam to sort of advocate on their behalf, and indeed those Jews are successful, because when the Dutch West India Company eventually responds, this correspondent as well is online, you can find it in its sort of original, I'm paraphrasing. The Dutch West India Company says, well, we agree that they're very problematic, but they are owners. They own a lot of capital in the stock of the Dutch West India Company. And so Peter Stuyvesant is precluded from being able to expel these Jews from New Amsterdam. And the condition that the company places on this small group of Jews is that they have, in order to stay, they have to be responsible for themselves. In other words, they cannot become part of the public dole. And so indeed, that sort of auspicious beginning sets a stage of sort of Jewish philanthropy in North America that is very much oriented towards caring for communities of Jews who, as you might imagine, faced some difficulties not only as a non-Christian minority, but also, and this is particularly important in the late 19th and early 20th century, as Americans who have ambiguous racial identities for a long time. And so I sort of wanted to begin there by saying that sort of model in which Jewish money is sort of collected in service of supporting Jews, the language and the literature is co-religionists, very much stays the course for much of what follows. Over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, Jewish congregations grew in cities like New York, Newport, Rhode Island, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, and other places. On the eve of the Revolution, there are estimated between 1,000 and 2,500 Jews in North America. Not that many. On the eve of the Civil War, that number has grown to between 150,000 and 200,000. Most of that increase is due to an influx, a wave of immigration, mostly from Central Europe, mostly German Jews beginning in the 1820s. And across the 19th century, to deal with this growth in population, Jews established a whole host of benevolent organizations that are intended to assist community members in need, to provide monetary support, material aid, and education. Some of those examples, the Hebrew Orphan Society, the Female Hebrew Benevolent Society, and B'nai B'rith, an organization, a fraternal organization that still exists today. These benevolent groups were part of an effort by American Jews, often American Jewish women, to take responsibility for the well-being of their co-religionists. This was very much built on the European model, in which Jewish communities in Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, largely before emancipation, existed as sort of semi-autonomous, independently self-governed community organizations where indeed Jews were responsible for each other. They also paid very high taxes for that privilege to do so. But the most drastic transformations to the population of American Jews comes in the late 19th century with a massive wave of immigration, largely from Southern and Eastern Europe, beginning in 1881. A date that you might know as one of the sort of dates that there are large-scale outbreaks of violence against Jews in Europe. Scholars estimate that some 2.5 million Jews entered the U.S. between 1881 and 1924, when free and open immigration to the U.S. came to an end. It was this wave of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe that really helped to spur the development of what we might call or recognize as large-scale Jewish philanthropy. Southern and Eastern European Jews flooded American cities. They settled in Philadelphia's South Side, Boston's North End, Baltimore's South Side, Chicago's West End, and of course, the one you probably know best, New York's Lower East Side. And driven by a Jewish cultural tradition of taking care of one's own, the institutions that emerged really were created to address the needs of the immigrants who had sort of arrived at the turn of the century. Previously, American Jews had given to synagogues and to a limited number of welfare agencies, but the scale of need drastically changed around the turn of the century. And so what came into existence in the late 19th century and remains today at the very center of a sort of structure, an institutional structure of Jewish philanthropy, is what we would call Jewish federations. Most big cities have a federation. I think they're now in the neighborhood of 150, but they represent many more communities than that. The first federation began in Boston in 1895, where Jews created a centralized communal organization that brought together under one umbrella all of the local fundraising groups. And the original federation model was simple, the immediate distribution of all money collected. In its early incarnation, it was decidedly against the idea of endowments or the accumulation of reserve dollars to plan for the future. And so federations in their early years almost exclusively were devoted to local concerns: healthcare, child welfare, assistance for the disabled, care for the elderly. Each year, masses of individual donors would give mostly modest gifts to be allocated in that year, and the following year, if they felt confident in the institution, they would give again. One scholar, Lila Corwin Berman, who's at NYU, has called this citizen philanthropy. Although much of this kind of individual giving wanes during the Great Depression, I think because all Americans, Jews included, have far less access to capital. But things really changed in the middle of the 20th century for American Jews, who grew wealthier thanks not only to higher education, to increased professional opportunities, but also to overall U.S. growth. And so many of the communities that had previously been the recipients of large amounts of donations no longer relied on charitable agencies. This was, of course, also a reflection of the fact that the federal government started offering a number of social welfare entitlements to all Americans, including to Jews. And so many in the field of Jewish philanthropy noted that the combination of Jewish socioeconomic privilege and state social welfare programs demanded a new strategy for philanthropy. And so in this new era, really came to be, in the early post-war years, Jewish philanthropy came to be defined by sort of two things. On one hand, questions about Jewish identity, and also questions of endowments. And so starting in the 1950s, Jewish federations, by the way, all these individual federations eventually in the early 30s come into one unified umbrella federation that sort of oversees all of these individual local federations. So starting in the 1950s, Jewish federations that had been once unable or unwilling to build endowments begin doing so. They worked with lawyers and accountants and stockbrokers to learn to sell Jews on the idea of stepping outside of the annual campaign tradition and its sort of money in, money out logics. And so instead, Jewish philanthropy was reframed in the post-war years as a large and long-term proposition, not one that necessarily had to meet sort of immediate demands. And instead, unlike that sort of earlier fulfillment of pressing basic needs, securing Jewish identity comes to be one of the primary commitments of the Jewish philanthropic endeavor. And as a result, Jewish federations pioneered the channeling of endowments into special studies, to research programs, and most importantly, educational and cultural activities. Federations could sort of see the future in a different kind of way and envision ways that their work would foster the long-term goals of fostering Jewish identity, a term that would become sort of almost emblematic of late 20th century Judaism. And indeed, by the late 1960s, large federations were allocating nearly 1/4 of their budgets to Jewish education. In an era in which Jewish education and culture became to be seen as, in this period, as a key to what was then sort of referred to as Jewish survival. And of course, that term itself is laden in a post-Holocaust world, in the wake of the Holocaust. And indeed, these sort of endowments were sort of put to work to sort of address this sort of challenge or imagined challenge of sort of Jewish survival. Intermarriage is one of the metrics that come to produce this sense of crisis or sense of sort of a need for a program of survival. American Jews, like actually lots of Americans, turn in the post-war years to the possibility of data-driven sort of surveys and solutions and the way that data can then sort of point in ways to sort of fixing the problems that communities are facing. Across the post-war years, there's sort of increasing data that suggests that American Jews are intermarrying at huge rates. And this actually comes to a real apex in the early 1990s, when the data suggests, in fact, that more than half of all American Jews are marrying non-Jewish Americans. And this, coupled with a pretty steep drop-off in Jewish birth rates, sort of portends an imperiled Jewish future. And Jewish philanthropy sort of steps in as a sort of mechanism of addressing those kinds of challenges. At the same time, individual Jews begin seemingly to give less money, at least to designated Jewish causes. And so researchers sort of note this in the 1980s and 1990s, but what they had overlooked was something entirely different, which was the rise of Jewish mega donors. And federations had originally sort of helped to cultivate this category of people who give huge sums of money. They had sort of cultivate this by courting their wealthiest supporters to put money into endowment funds. But those federations often then soon lost out on many of these donors, who then were sort of lost to the allure of private foundations and family foundations. So thanks to favorable tax laws and policies that were deregulating finance, private Jewish family foundations expanded. They increased from roughly 3,000 in the mid-1990s to more than 10,000 a decade later. And while many of these foundations, Jewish family foundations, were small, a few were so large and well-funded, well-capitalized, that they seem to suggest that the ideals of communal giving, right, where lots of, millions of individual Jews give small sums of money, seem to have become a thing of the past. I think I'll end my comments by pointing to perhaps one of the most notable examples of this, that is Birthright Israel, a program that the American Jewish community has heralded and celebrated since it was founded in the late 1990s. funded by Michael Steinhardt, Charles Bronfman, Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, the Steinhardts, and a handful of other immensely wealthy Jewish families. This funds a free trip for young Jews to go to Israel. Birthright is intended as a program of the masses, and indeed it is immensely successful by its own metrics. It has taken nearly 850,000 American Jews to Israel. The Pew data suggests that nearly 1 out of every 5 American Jews aged 18 to 46 has participated. And indeed, of course, at the very center of Birthright is a sort of effort to inculcate a love of Israel in young American Jews. But as a scholar of American religion, I would say that as important as the sort of Israel connection and education piece are, what its founders are even more proud of are the ways in which they imagine that Birthright has addressed that problem of Jewish survival. And indeed, they tout the sort of data around how this trip to Israel has not necessarily encouraged very many Jews at all to move to Israel, but has, when they return to America, to their American Jewish communities, sort of produced deep and sort of lasting connections. And perhaps most importantly, they are most proud, Birthright as an institution, most proud of the fact that the data suggests that Jews are about 50% more likely to marry other Jews if they have participated in Birthright. They also tout a whole host of these kinds of statistics. Another one, they're 122% more likely to celebrate their child's bar or bat mitzvah, a Jewish rite of passage. They're 84% more likely to raise their child exclusively Jewish, even when they choose not to marry a Jewish person. And so philanthropy really has come in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as a kind of tool deployed by a handful of ultra-wealthy American Jews to set an agenda and to set a series of sort of policy suggestions to address this sort of perceived sensibility that without intervention, the American Jewish community's future is not guaranteed. I think maybe I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening.
Amazing. Thank you, Kate. Tanise, we'll turn to you now.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. As Dave mentioned, and also Matt's kind invitation, I'm Tanise Chung Hoon. I am from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And my day job opportunity is to serve as the managing director of the Philanthropies department of the church. And I was fascinated when Dave shared the invitation to say, hey, we're talking about what's distinctive, what's unique, what are some things that drive philanthropic efforts. And so I want to talk a little bit about people generally, but specifically about Latter-day Saints and how we look at things. So as I was thinking about what made us specifically the same, or what was distinctive, I thought, okay, well, what makes us the same? Everyone in the world has two things that we share. We share the same 24 hours in a day if we are privileged to live another day. And we also have the privilege of deciding how we're going to use that time to accomplish things, whether it's good, whether it's not good. That's something that we get to define, but the idea of time and choice is essential for us as humans to be able to determine how we are going to make an impact in the world. Aristotle, sorry, I'm going to keep moving our thing here. Aristotle shared this idea long ago where he said to give away money is an easy matter and in any man's power, but to decide to whom to give it, how large and when, and for what purpose and how is neither in every man's power nor an easy matter. Hence it is that such excellence is rare, praiseworthy, and normal. It's hard to decide how to use our time, how to use our resources, but also how to use them well, and thinking about that. So we think about, well, why does that matter? Does it matter? Does it matter that someone can use their time making a difference in the lives of the humans around them, or if they're doing something that's completely self-focused, and does that make a difference in who they are and what the impact is on them individually as well as the people around them? In our experience, the answer to that is absolutely yes, and I'll talk about that. So thinking about our purpose as a people, as Latter-day Saints, but also I think as human beings that these principles relate. It's fascinating to me that this is Easter week, this is Holy Week, where we think about our Savior Jesus Christ and the things that he did to make a difference for the human family. And I really love this picture. This is a depiction of the Last Supper where Jesus is teaching his disciples, the 12 apostles, about service and about sacrifice. And they don't quite understand what's going to happen, but he's helping them think in a tangible way about doing something physical to make a difference and serve and lead. So he says in Matthew 22, these are the two great commandments. Jesus said unto him, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And I think earlier that we had the question, how do you define a neighbor? What is a neighbor? And when we think about serving God, and I think that's one of the things that Kate was just talking about, is that when we think about what we're using our resources for to help accomplish the best thing for us, when you consider the vertical as well as the horizontal, that really influences how you choose to use your time and your energies and your choices. So the simplest way that I think about charity and philanthropy is living with love. That we are striving and thinking about living and touching the people around us and even our own lives. And if we're motivated by love for God as well as the love for the people around us, that transforms what our decisions will be. Our church leader, this is a picture of Russell M. Nelson, who is the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we see him as a prophet, seer, and revelator, that he has shared this counsel. He says, Latter-day Saints, as with other followers of Jesus Christ, are always looking for ways to help, to lift and to love others. They truly seek to live the first and second great commandments. When we love God with all of our hearts, he turns our hearts to the well-being of others in a beautiful, virtuous cycle. Here is the mission of philanthropies of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that we want to help individuals and families to follow the example of the Lord Jesus Christ as they live the two great commandments, to love God and their neighbors. This commitment is often evidenced through sacrifice and giving. And giving helps members and others experience the joy and blessings of participating in God's work as they choose to follow inspiration and prophetic direction. And to do this, we facilitate and invite voluntary philanthropic giving beyond tithes and fast offering for programs and projects approved by the First Presidency. I will make a point that we see philanthropy as beyond tithing. Tithing is an invitation, a commandment, actually, that we can choose to follow, and we are blessed by it. I know that Reed made a point about this in an earlier session, but 10% is what Latter-day Saints give as an indication of a token for their commitment and covenant with God. And we get to keep the other 90%, so that's pretty generous because we see everything as belonging to him. But philanthropy is beyond that 10%, is how we define it as a people. So we look at it as living the gospel of Jesus Christ. There's 4 things that we look at and try to accomplish in our devotion and the way that we follow, and how it's manifest in our lives. So living the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we care for those in need, that we're inviting all to come unto Christ, and we seek to unite families for eternity. And this is evidenced by a covenant commitment. It's inside of us and our desire to be able to make a difference. And that is one of the strongest drivers, again, as Kate has talked about, how people think about caring for the people around them because of what they believe. And this is how it's manifest in our faith. So when we think about philanthropy, why philanthropy? It's consecrated giving. It helps people act upon their best character and covenants. And this is done by inviting people to exercise their agency, to act under the influence of the Holy Ghost by giving sacred and tangible gifts of self. Time, talent, treasure's obvious physical manifestation, and testimony. So we're advocating to build the kingdom of God, and success occurs when the giving experience is simple, easy, and joyful, and inspired. We would term it a celestial giving experience. That's our goal, is that each person would have the opportunity to do something where they're choosing. Because if something is compelled, then it is not an opportunity for us to use our agency and to choose to give. When you think about God, He is the greatest giver. Every example that He has, and He wants us to be just like He is. And so the way that we can do that in practice is that we are making those choices to become like He is. So living with love is what we're striving to do as we think about charity. Charity is, in words of our scripture, we consider it the pure love of Christ. And the pure love of Christ, is a preposition that can be used in three different ways. That I can have a love from God, where I feel that love and I want to exercise my choice to be able to show Him how I love Him. I have a love for God, which is where I am striving to keep His commandments and do the things that He would like all of His children to do, to indicate that they're showing that they're loyal, and striving to become like He is. And to love like God is the part where I think where we see the gospel in action, where I'm striving to do something as His hands here upon the earth and act in a way that I think He would if He was here. And so that pure love, that charity, is something that I'm striving to do. And that concludes my 10-minute introduction. So I'll go back to the panel.
Thank you, Tanise. All right. Heather, I think we'll come to you first. I'm curious about the historical perspective that you have with evangelicals and philanthropy. In 2018, I said earlier that you'd written your book, Holy Humanitarians, American Evangelicals and Global Aid. I'm curious, what are some of the things that you learned or discovered writing that book?
Well, maybe I'll just take it and say how much I was, first of all, just enjoyed hearing the other two presentations, and also I'm thinking a little bit about resonances. So one of the things that's sticking out to me the most is resonates a little bit with what Kate said about how in the period of the late 19th, early 20th century, it really, and also with what we just heard from Tanise, like the idea that philanthropy was a practice that everybody did. Right, philanthropy, charity, that this was, and it was a period of time, I think another important distinction between that time and ours also is something that Kate alluded to, is the way in which we weren't living in a period in which the government, there was no USAID, and actually now there isn't any USAID anymore, but there wasn't Social Security, there weren't social safety nets. So for everyone, religious groups were involved. And I think this is true for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as well. And I'm less familiar with that history, but my sense of it is that there was just, from the very early days, a very strong commitment to caring for other members of the community. And I think Tanise's point, that tithing was a duty. There was a creation of a really strong social welfare apparatus within the church in early days, and the ways in which, a lot of that shifted over the course of the 20th century because of, I think, two things. One is, well, maybe three. One is the federalization of certain kinds of aid. Probably, I think, in my view, even more significant is the sort of in the massive wealth inequality, that occurred, and the amassing of fortune. So one of the things that I didn't say a ton about in this talk, but I do talk about a lot in my book, is this tension between someone like Andrew Carnegie and these magnates who accumulated these vast amounts of wealth and had very strong views about philanthropy. So I think Kate and I, again, there's a lot of resonance about who deserved it and what it was for and who didn't. And that took away, I think, from the sense that everybody was a child of God and deserved to be helped, even as there were some deeper issues that needed to be addressed. So I think I was saying, again, like this tension between the Christian Herald folks insisted that Andrew Carnegie and his people, from his point of view, wanted to shut down soup kitchens, right? That you shouldn't have these because that just enabled people to keep going back and getting handouts, as opposed to, my folks were adamant about having that, but they also said we need to get at the reasons why we need soup kitchens in the first place. So I think with those critics and the massive accumulation of wealth, you started to have these huge endowed philanthropies like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and that really changed how philanthropy worked, although it's not to say that ordinary people stopped giving, but I do think it changed the dynamic. And then and part of the reason that happened that we haven't talked about too much is because, I think Kate mentioned it, changes in the tax code, right? That this really encouraged an accumulation of wealth and the creation of endowments, as opposed to the idea that you collected money. Like, I'm struck about how similar the Jewish welfare boards and the Christian Herald operated. You took in money and you gave it all out. There weren't really operating expenses or even overhead. You just collected and you distributed. So I will stop there, and maybe love to hear what others have to say.
Thank you. Tanise, I wanted to pivot and go to you for a second. I think there's been some public pressure and criticism for the perspective that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is accumulating all this wealth, and there's pressure that they're not giving it away fast enough, or why is there such this accumulation? Do you want to speak to that and what the philosophy is around that approach that they're taking currently?
Sure. I want to make the point that we are a church and not a charity. And so often people will view, at least in the way the Americanized idea of a foundation or a charity, that there's a certain amount that should be spent, or it needs to have a certain percentage, and the reporting and other things. And because we are a church, our purpose and focus is helping people come unto Christ. And when I ask friends, because friends will say, you've got plenty of resources. Do you really need more? And is this? And I say, well, how much is enough to prepare for the kingdom of God? Do you have a number that you think that it should have, or that there's so much? And on the other hand, I also ask, well, if we were to give all of the church's resources to try to alleviate poverty and truly emptied out all the coffers, would we still be able to accomplish what our church mission and purpose is? We couldn't do that. And so not only are they striving to be good stewards of the resources in making sure that we have what we need for current funding, as well as planning for the future, but we also plan for the days of scarcity, when the church still needs to function as the church, even when resources are not available. And so those concepts and ideas are one of the reasons that the church is a careful and a good steward. And also, we also, if our government were to function this way, if we were not to spend more than we have in the bank, we would not have a deficit. But that is not how we live as a country, and sometimes generally as people. And the church is very disciplined about that fact, that they would not spend more than they have in resources so that they can ensure to continue doing what the mission and purpose is.
Well, I think it's also been brought up that a lot of the assets of the church are not
Non-income
not
producing.
income producing, but income consuming. When you look
Correct.
at the proliferation of Latter-day Saint temples going around the world, those are not income producing.
No. Nor are meeting houses, nor is humanitarian aid. It's given freely, and there's no requirement for people to pay for anything. And so much good is being accomplished, and it's interesting how people want to spend someone else's money.
Kate, I wanted to ask you a couple questions here about just it's amazing how philanthropy could potentially be negative or get get arrows, and I'm curious, amongst American Jews, it seems like there's a lot of pressure as to where those funds end up, how they're given, how much is given. What are your thoughts or feelings around how American Jews are giving, and how openly they discuss and share how they're giving because of some of the negative implications of their charitable kindness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's.
Can you pull that a little
Oh,
closer?
yes, of course. I mean, yes, there certainly are, as I was pointing to, critiques about the ways in which there is a kind of concentration of Jewish wealth into the hands of the few, and that those few have an outsized say in not just how their dollars are spent, but also in the direction of community programming, in questions of ethics and values and morals. And so there is some contestation. There is also real contestation about the fact that when you have a small group of people producing those programs, that they have the potential to be very narrowly construed. Because I used my example of birthright earlier, I'll use it again here. Beginning in the late 2010s, 2017, 2018, 2019, there have been pretty wide protests on the part of birthright participants who have gone on a trip and sort of thought to themselves, I'm not really getting the whole story here about the history of Israel, the history of Zionism, and in particular about the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. And they have publicly critiqued not just birthright, but the entire educational apparatus of American Jews for having developed an educational program vis-a-vis Israel that is supportive of its general consensus that American Jews are supportive of Israel. The ground, though, is really shifting under our feet as we speak on this issue, and I guess to maybe even counter my own comments in which I sort of said Jewish giving has really gone away from these sort of smaller individual sort of donations to large-scale ones. The current estimates are that in the weeks and months after October 7th, American Jews raised almost more than $750 million and donated them to Jewish federations. And that Jewish federations are indeed now the arbiters of how that massive money goes, much of which it will indeed go to Israel and Israeli causes. And consequently, actually, there has been a little bit of data, but more anecdotal evidence that actually American Jews who otherwise were giving in small donations to lots of different kinds of Jewish causes have actually pulled back on those sort of American Jewish causes in service of giving money to federations to direct to Israel. I think that this is also a reality that the other thing that's sort of shifting under the sort of our feet in terms of American Jewish politics are that if until 10 years ago, the real obsession of American Jewish communities were these questions of continuity and sort of addressing a sort of perceived imperiled future, that now anti-Semitism is really at the top of the agenda for American Jews, and indeed that is reflective in their massive sort of recalibration and giving to Israel, precisely because I think the majority of American Jews, although there's a real generational shift here, continue to believe that the existence of the State of Israel is the best guarantor of Jewish safety. I will say that, of course, with the caveat that there are large and increasing numbers of American Jews, particularly under the age of 40, who dispute that point exactly, that Israel they would say is no longer a guarantor of Jewish safety, but maybe even a producer of insecurity for Jews around the globe. So I think that this isn't very much a kind of robust and open conversation. Obviously the family foundation choices are more opaque and we know less about them. But, there is robust internal Jewish communal debate about how the money gets collected and who gets a say. And even after the decisions are made, there are robust conversations about whether those decisions were correct or not, or whether they were, good. I would say that all of this ultimately is premised, and this is ideas I think both of my, co-panelists suggested, on calculations of what is good for American Jews, right? A sort of deep and abiding sensibility that all Jews have an obligation to care for each other. This is, the language that the American Jews would use here would be tzedakah, right? In some ways, from the Hebrew root tzedek, right, meaning justice, but also from a really central sort of Talmudic aphorism, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zevaza. All Jews are responsible for each other, and this sort of sensibility that among, American Jews, many options, and to give to both Jewish and non-Jewish causes, that they have a fundamental Jewish obligation to ensure that fellow Jews are taken care of.
Tanise, I wanted to come back to you. It feels like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has been more open with how funds are given, and this question of who is your neighbor has come up, and there seems to be a lot more open collaboration with other faiths and other causes. Is that a strategic shift, or is this just more media coverage? Or is the definition of the neighbor changing?
I don't know that a definition of a neighbor is changing. I think that we are being more deliberate about people saying that your neighbor is not just a member of our faith. We see everyone as a child of God. And if we're living into our covenants that we want to, Joseph Smith has a quote where he says that no man is content until who is a covenant-keeping member goes about trying to benefit everyone in the world, that he would be willing to give his life for any faith if he truly is living his religion. And so I think that the collaborations are increasing because we need one another. We absolutely need each other as people of faith, because there are more, if Pew Research is to be believed, that there are more nuns, which is not N-U-Ns, but N-O-N-E-S's, that people are no longer identifying with any type of faith at all. And if that's the case, then who will they turn to when there's a challenge? And especially as governments or other social constructions kind of collapse, if you do not have a faith community, where would you turn? And so I think that we have to link arms with one another, and we have more in common than we have that are different. And I think we're seeing that more as we are all being maybe tossed into the same space and maybe the same persecution. We're grateful that we have a wonderful representative of the Jewish faith as the quarterback at BYU right now. He calls himself BYU Jew. So we're grateful for Jake Retzloff and also him living his faith so faithfully, and we celebrate that with him.
Thank you. Heather, one more question for you, and then we'll prepare to open it up for the audience. Back to this question of, charity used to be considered a uniting force, but at times it feels like family foundations, charitable organizations are just as likely to be criticized for how they give. In the evangelical Christian space, is it moving back towards a uniting force, or is it fracturing? What are you seeing with the historical perspective?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking specifically about the time that I wrote about. It's the late 19th century. There were so many forces, so many things that were dividing people. And we're in another time like that, right? So the idea was that so I'll just take the example since we've been talking about interreligious cooperation. The late 19th century, the American Protestant community was fracturing over how to read the Bible, right? So there were debates about this. Was at the very beginning of historical criticism of the Bible and seeing the Bible in its historical context. And so there were all sorts of debates about whether or not how the Bible was inspired, arguments about whether Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the Pentateuch, or not. And so one of my favorite quotes from my book is, the sense that we're not going to argue about whether or not Moses wrote the Pentateuch, but we may not agree about that, but we can all agree that we should follow the first and second commandment to love God with our whole heart and love our neighbor as ourselves, and that is something that can unite all Christians and Jews across a community. And so I wish I felt like that was true today. I mean, what I seeing today is a sense that, I just read an article about sort of the comments about Elon Musk that empathy is the weakness of Western civilization, and that there are a number of books written that I hadn't heard about, but by contemporary right-wing Christians agreeing with this idea, and I think that my evangelical Christians from the late 19th century would be appalled by some of the social Darwinist thinking that is going on now about sort of who deserves empathy and who doesn't. And so, I mean, just maybe a hopeful, so I don't see that happening now, unfortunately, in some sectors, but even just, part of why I really wanted to be a part of this conversation today is that it's encouraging, I think, to be in conversation with diverse communities where maybe all 3 of our presentations to a certain extent could lift up the commonality, and is that a way forward? I think for what Tanise just said about, are there communities that can come back to seeing some common ground in the fundamental commandments of a faith, even when within a particular community you might disagree, right? And it doesn't make it easy. I think going back to what Kate said, you're still going to have plenty of debates, as my folks did as well, about how to operationalize those principles, but at least you could agree about the principle that this should be something that we want to do. And I think, my concern right in this exact moment that there seems to be a lot of people who don't agree that this is what we want to do as individuals, as religious communities, as a nation. The last thing I'll say is, one of the concerns I had about the Christian Herald, and it's still true, was the way that they linked this vision of being the most charitable nation it was also a way of justifying America's imperialism and sort of emergence, and that this was going to be some distinctive way. There was a kind of a link between charity and American nationalism. And that, I think, was a dangerous decision. I think in some of the ways that Kate has pointed out, with the way Jewish charity can sometimes function to support nationalism and empire. At the same time, the idea that they wanted the United States distinguishing mark as a nation to be charitable, to have empathy, to try to create a global community, was something that it's unfortunate to see that is not something that people are even paying lip service to anymore at the highest echelons of power.
Thank you, Heather. All right, we are going to turn to you, audience. If you have specific questions, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll try to get to as many of you as I can.
I'm going to actually take prerogative and start, because I have a question. It relates to something I think particularly, Kate, you spoke about, and that is a way in which, and also Tanise, we might distinguish from charity given or done by religious communities as opposed to more broader forms of charity that we might call secular. I was really struck, Kate, by this notion that charity is a way to promote Jewishness among people to whom the charity is given. I am interested in hearing from all 3 panelists about how we might think of charitable giving as a religious practice, a religious discipline for the giver as well as for the receiver, and how the act of giving charity might be read in a religious way as some sort of spiritual discipline. Whichever one of you would like to go to that first.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think, yes, lots of American Jews understand this as a religious practice as much as they see it as a communal obligation. Those things, the sort of line between those two things are blurry. I think something that I think a lot about that I'm not sure is sort of widely known is that many, maybe even most American Jewish synagogues, there are sort of two holidays in the fall that are sort of the anchors of the Jewish calendar. One of them is Yom Kippur, a Day of Atonement, and Jews, once the holiday starts, they don't, write. All the same rules that apply to sort of Sabbath observance apply. So you can't use electricity, you can't, write. But often at the beginning of, or the beginning of a sermon for the sort of evening of Yom Kippur, what will be passed around are little cards that you can fold over at a certain place to indicate a financial contribution to the congregation for the year. So in other words, the largest annual giving campaign is sort of rooted inside of the worship service itself. And I think that while many American Jews are often reticent to speak of their identity in sort of biblical terms, they are really happy to sort of understand that kind of giving as a kind of, and this language I think has been echoed by others, not necessarily that everything is owned by God. That I think is a less of a sort of prominent idea in Jewish spaces, but certainly the idea that all people are created in the image of God, right? And that is a really sort of anchoring sort of sensibility that you treat other people as if they themselves are also have sort of a godly expression. So yes, I absolutely think, in other words, that this kind of giving is deeply rooted in a sort of religious sensibility, even if in many ways it is now often contributes to a sort of set of identity projects as opposed to necessarily the sort of nuts and bolts of sort of religion as sort of in the most normative sense, of course.
Tanise or Heather?
Well, I think that I indicated this before, but thinking about how giving is essentially a manifestation of what we believe. And so, yes, as a religious practice, that if I am striving to see the people around me and recognize and act upon a need, I can do it in an informal way. And most of it is informal. There's, at least in philanthropies, that we do not have specific giving days per se, except at the institutions of higher education. That those would be related to education specifically, and there are not, but I will take that back. Each month, Latter-day Saints fast, and when we fast, that is part of our commitment that we would give what we would have spent to that. But that's not necessarily considered philanthropy. It's defined by philanthropy by the U.S. government for tax purposes, but it's not by Latter-day Saints seen as philanthropy. It's just a commitment and a fulfillment of following through on our covenants. So philanthropy above and beyond that, I think is just something that people feel touched by, inspired by, and usually even when you don't have a lot, if you have what your needs are, then you feel charitable. You feel like you want to do something for someone else, and all of us get to decide how much is enough. And so even when we don't have, by the world standards, a lot of things, if we have sufficient for our needs, then we're willing to share what we have with other people. I don't know if that answers the question, Matt, or not, but.
Denise, I have a couple other examples, though. Like anyone that wants to serve a mission, there's missionary funds that people will give, and that's directly connected with growing the kingdom of God. Or like what's being done with education and the Pathways program. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit, but it's basically closing the gap so that anyone in the world can basically become educated, and that's connected to to the religious beliefs as well.
It is, and having opportunities for people to have access, that there would not be a limitation because of financial limits, that they would have access to be able to do that. And the majority of missionaries in the world pay for the privilege of being able to go and serve, and if they can afford it, then they will fund their portion of the mission. But we have an equalized, when people contribute to the missionary fund, that it becomes an equalized investment so that each missionary, if someone's serving in Japan or London, England, that would be much more expensive than somewhere in South America, but they pay the same amount, and so they distribute it to missionaries throughout the world. So yes, when people want, and someone who has education, BYU Pathway Worldwide is a program where they localize the expense. So if you were living in Venezuela, you might pay $4 a credit to be able to go to school, as compared to $35 or $68 in the United States, that those would be, and then they are subsidized across so that they can scale that. So there's no limitation based on where you live, that you should be able to have the same access.
I'm particularly interested in the mission example. That's a good one because it gets to kind of the heart of what I'm talking about. I think that a mission is maybe something that you are that's spoken of as doing service for other people, but it's also understood to change the giver, right? It is a discipline for the giver. And charity then in these ways kind of functions as a modality that makes you or develops your identity as a member of your particular faith tradition, apart from whoever you might be giving it to. Heather, anything like this in the Protestant world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about the arguments that the Christian Herald constantly made were along these same lines. They used, it wasn't just about who is your neighbor, but who is the person crossing the road to help the neighbor. And I think, and again, just coming back to the point that this was for everyone. So they often use the story of the widow giving her mite, right? I mean, so it was, and then they included lots of stories of, every person that made a contribution to any one of their charitable campaigns were listed in these, were published in the newspaper, either anonymously or by name. And they would really commend like Sunday school classes of young kids that were doing, I think, just what you suggested, Tanise, like deciding that they were going to forego a meal and then send any of the money that would have been used to purchase that meal to the communities in India that were suffering from famine, where there were missionaries that were serving them. So I definitely think there was a sense that charity was a commandment. This is what you were required to do. But it was also a spiritual discipline and transformational for every person, no matter. And I think this is, again, it gets back to what Kate was talking about, the challenge that comes when you start to think about sort of the accumulation of wealth and the idea that only certain people are supposed to, that, there were sort of superstars in philanthropy as opposed to every person being transformed by this practice.
Thank you, Heather. All right, hands for questions.
Might I suggest that maybe we collect a few questions in the service of time? Like maybe take 2 or 3 together?
Sure. I don't know how we do that, but.
Yeah.
You want to go?
Okay.
He hasn't asked the question yet.
Yeah. So why don't you ask a question somewhat briefly, then I'm going to give it to Jessica too, and we'll take both of them at the same time.
So our resources have significantly increased since, I would say, the 70s, of how we've accumulated wealth across different sects of religion. And so when I looked statistically, in the 1970s, through some research, 91% people believed there were active Christians in the U.S. In 2007, it dropped to 78%, And in the last 5-6 years, it's dropped down to 64-63%. So my question, I guess I was curious, is we have a lot of resources, different religions working together, working to do all of this philanthropy across the U.S. and outside of the U.S. And I guess my question is, we're doing all of this great work, but yet the belief is still declining. And it's kind of like, what is the cause of effect on that? And one of the questions I keep thinking about is, I feel sometimes we have all of these powerful religions that have resources. Has there ever been a discussion to work more together as a unity? We have different beliefs, but we need to, how do we battle people that are against Christianity? You know, you talked about what people are doing to the Jewish communities up in the East Coast and different colleges. You know, how do we create a strategic plan and execute it to say, hey, what are the top 5 things that they're battling against us, and how do we work together as a group to battle that and utilize our membership in our congregations to help us out? Because a lot of times I see even people like ourselves, like people that strive, that believe in God, if we speak out, there's so many other people that don't have a job, I'll be honest, that don't have much of a life, and they put us down, or they find out where we live, or they battle you and post you on Facebook or something like that. So I guess my thing is how do we get together? Have you guys ever thought about and fight as one to show that we are much more powerful, much more, there's more of us than people realize, but sometimes we're so set in our ways of whether we're raising a family, we're working.
So is the
I
question,
guess I just
is the
wanted to ask
question,
the
an
question
is the question an interfaith collaboration, and should we be doing that?
Yeah, I guess my overall question is, we need to use all possible resources to battle people that are very anti-Christ. Has there ever thought about working together in unity instead of parallel and not really working together, sharing resources? It could be information, it could be how we do it, utilizing people, communities within. So just wanted to ask that question. Has that ever been a topic of discussion?
In the interest of time, I'd love for one of you to take a shot at that if you'd like.
I'll jump in. I know that we're seeing a shift, that there's more opportunities and more inclination because, as you point out, as the decline is happening, that we are starting to recognize and find that. And I think that we're maturing as a country and maybe even as faith adherents, that we're seeing that it doesn't make us less faithful or less committed to our specific space by partnering with someone else, because we look at our commonalities over our differences. And we've seen that in our faith, especially in the last decade or more, that's happened more specifically and deliberately, where the church has been not only proactive, but they're building collaborations where that's happening more regularly.
Thank you.
I just have 2 quick comments, if that's okay. I mean, this would be the work that I do through the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, which is a institute that's run through the Lilly School of Philanthropy in Indianapolis, is an interfaith. I mean, it was founded by Protestants, but does a lot of work bringing together, training congregations from across the Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim. So there are organizations doing that. And then just another example that comes to mind that I haven't been involved in, but the Interfaith Youth Corps. There is a lot of, even on my own campus, the chaplaincy at Tufts, which we are no longer a religiously affiliated school, but the idea of interfaith collaboration around the Interfaith Youth Corps, the whole principle is doing charitable works, doing as a group of people of diverse points of view. And part of it really has to do with getting to know one another and sort of understanding, again, what my Klopshan Talmud would have called, the commonalities, but also I don't know that it has as much to do with outsiders as, again, maybe going back to Matthew's point about what it does to the people who participate. So I'll leave.
Thank you, Heather. We have a question in the back.
Hi, yeah. So I do also a lot of interfaith work, but that's aside. That's not, if you want to talk to me, I'll talk to you. This is like a critical question. So for all three of these traditions, the start of giving is like a mutual aid model, right? We're in community, I have something, you need something, we work together. And then as it gets more established, it moves into a charity model, and then we get philanthropy, which in my mind is like the big bucks, the big money, right? To Kate's point, the mega donors. And this question is mostly for Kate, but I think both the other speakers would have something to say about it. But this shift to the big money, and I'm going to say big money instead of philanthropy, because it has political impact. And so, like when Kate, you mentioned birthright, the critique of that, there was the documentary in the past 2 years, Israelism. And I don't know if you've heard of the other documentary that was produced by Big Money called Blind Spot as kind of the reaction to this. And what I find interesting is how this big money, while yes, it can do a lot of good, we can feed people, we can clothe people, we can get people education, but at the end of the day, it has the power to define who is and is not part of this community. And so that big money, for me that's working on a college campus trying to do interfaith work, that big money stops me from doing interfaith work. That big money tells me who I can and can't work with because the big money donor tells me who is and is not Jewish. And if we're talking about like Judaism specifically as like an ethnic community as opposed to a religious community, that creates a lot of problems. And so, and when the critique comes out, then it very quickly turns to, well, you just don't get it and you're being anti-Semitic, as opposed to saying like, but can we have a real conversation about the money and the politics and not the belief system and the identity? So
Do you have a specific question for Kate?
that's the specific question is like, how does that impact of that big money impact lived experiences and identity of individuals that are saying, I want to participate in this community, but this big money is stopping me from participating.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who spends my life on a college campus, I feel every word that you just said. I think there are sort of two things I want to say here. One is that the very nature of being Jewish is different than being a Christian. There are scholars, the most famous of which, Lior Batnitsky, would suggest that her book is How Judaism Became a Religion, right? Thinking about how the very category of religion sort of emerges with sort of emancipation and enlightenment and sort of defines and constrains Jewish life in particular kinds of ways. Before emancipation, in those sort of semi-autonomous Jewish-governed spaces, right, the thing that makes you Jewish is not whether or not you believe in God, right? What your feelings are about Jewish texts, but rather that you are of a Jewish people. It is a sense of peoplehood. And indeed, that sense of peoplehood retains a lot of power. But I think that, as you're pointing to, the reality that certain people with outsized influence, mostly due to their money, have imprinted into this space very clear boundaries about who counts or what counts as Jewish, makes these questions immensely complicated. And I think there is unbelievable amounts of intra-Jewish conflict precisely over these questions. They are playing out on college campuses, as you mentioned. They're the loudest and wealthiest Jews in the United States would say that those young Jews who have sympathy for Palestinians are either self-hating Jews or anti-Semites themselves. And this is not new, but it is a sort of, in terms of the model of sort of saying these people that we disagree with aren't real Jews, but that it has sort of been magnified in sort of really significant ways. So yeah, I think part of one barrier to questions of interfaith is precisely the fact that you can be secular and also Jewish, right? And indeed, there are parts of Christian theology that remain, I think, deeply uncomfortable for many American Jews, precisely around questions of successionism, questions of Christian eschatology and the role of Jews in it. And so it's not surprising to me that the barriers to interfaith work are high, given the extent to which, even though we think we're all talking about something called religion that is easily identifiable and definable, we are not. We're talking about something much, much messier, and that requires a lot of attention to difference in addition to attention to sameness.
Thank you. We have a question in the back.
Yeah, just I wanted to clarify something that Kate had said earlier. You made mention of those under 40 may have a different sort of view. I just wanted to clarify that that is what you said.
Yes.
And then related to that, then for other groups.
Can you speak right into the mic?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks.
For other groups, are we seeing any kind of like a cohort effect or a shift among people under 40? Just curious.
I mean, if your question is particularly about the Israel politics, then I think the answer is definitively yes. Although I would say that those shifts are happening actually across the board. They're just more magnified in people under 40.
Under 40. Well, and so then for other groups like in the LDS Church or Protestant groups, are you seeing any sort of shift with those under 40 as well?
Heather, any thoughts there, or Tanise?
I'm not totally sure shifts in terms of engagement, or I'm not quite sure I understand the question. So maybe I'll pass it off to Tanise to try.
I will try. We term the group we call it the rising generation. And we see the rising generation in some ways playing against type in terms of what the media will present. We have many that are extremely interested, faithful, engaged, and they have a great deal of empathy. And I think that that's something that's just I don't know if it's part of the world or how they're taught or they've just arrived that way.
Or scarcity.
Yes.
That they were raised under.
So the empathy for seeing the challenges that others face, and they really want to help. And they seem to be naturally inclined to be charitable and philanthropic. And that gives me great confidence and excitement about the future, because that rising generation does want to reach across an aisle to link arms and say, hey, we're here in this together. And it probably is. I mean, the world that we live in and environments and other things that they're saying, gosh, what do we get to live with in the future? And it's up to us. So how are we going to do this together? And that's, to me, encouraging and exciting.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. We're going to wrap up now, but we need more of these conversations, don't we? I mean, this has been incredibly powerful. Thank you so much to our panelists.
We are going to take a half-hour break, come back at 3 o'clock for our panel on religion and media.